The cowboy had waited months for the woman whose letters kept him alive. But why did he go completely still when a stranger stepped off the train and whispered, "I'm not the white woman you expected"? The train screamed against the rails as red dust burst across the platform. A woman held out a blue-ribboned letter with trembling fingers, while the departing whistle echoed behind her. The cowboy never reached for it. Around them, every sound seemed to disappear, except the wind and one impossible sentence. What did that letter reveal that left them both unable to walk away? Share where you're watching from as the story begins. The St. Louis train gave one last metallic shriek before grinding to a stop beside the weathered platform at Dust Valley. Red dust rolled beneath the wheels and climbed the hems of the passengers stepping down. Men lifted crates. A woman gathered two sleepy children. The conductor checked his pocket watch and called out that the train would leave again in 3 minutes. Jonah Hale stood beyond the depot awning with his hat pulled low. One hand held the final telegram Evelyn Cross had sent from Missouri. The paper had softened at the folds from being opened too many times. Arriving late April, please meet the train. He had expected a pale woman with delicate handwriting and careful thoughts about hard country, lonely houses, and people brave enough to begin again. The last passenger stepped down carrying a canvas suitcase. She was a black woman in a dark traveling dress, the cuffs worn shiny from use. Dust settled across her boots before both feet reached the platform. Her face showed the exhaustion of a long journey, but her shoulders remained straight. In one hand, she carried a sealed envelope tied with a faded blue ribbon. Several people near the freight scale stopped pretending not to watch. The woman found Jonah at once. She drew a breath, lifted the suitcase, and walked toward him. "I'm not the white woman you expected," she said. Jonah's gaze rested on her face, then moved to the letter. "But this is Evelyn's. She died asking me to place it in your hands." The depot seemed to go quiet around them. Jonah did not reach for the envelope. Behind her, the conductor called, "All aboard!" For one brief second, the woman turned her head toward the train. The open carriage door waited only a few yards away. Then she faced Jonah again and kept her arm extended. He finally closed his rough hand around the letter. "When?" "3 weeks ago." His jaw tightened. "She never said she was dying." "No. Your Nine Cross, her sister." Something in her voice unsettled him. Not the words, the rhythm beneath them. He had heard it somewhere before, though he could not place where. The train pulled away with a hard jolt. Steam drifted across the platform, hiding them from each other for a moment. When it cleared, Nan remained beside her suitcase. "I need a room until the eastbound train returns." A woman in a plain gray dress approached from the road, carrying a covered basket. Mrs. Mei Chen owned the boarding house across from the freight office. She gave Nan one quick, understanding look. "I wish I had one," she said. "Railroad crew took every bed. Next passenger train is 12 days out." Nan's fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. Jonah looked toward the lowering sun. The nearest lodging beyond Mrs. Chen's was several miles south. "I have an east room," he said. "Door of its own. You won't be expected to cook or keep house. When the train comes, I'll bring you back." Nan studied him long enough to make certain the offer carried no hidden claim. 12 days? 12. All right. The road to Hale Ranch crossed open country beneath red cliffs and a wide, pale sky. Sagebrush leaned in the wind. Dry creek beds cut through abandoned fence lines. Jonah drove without conversation. Nan watched the ground. She noticed old irrigation cuts buried beneath weeds and patches where the earth was gray on top but nearly black, where wagon wheels had broken the crust. "You know soil?" Jonah asked. "A little." He gave no answer, though his eyes returned to her once before the ranch came into view. Hale Ranch was sound enough to survive another winter, but it looked as though survival was all it had been asked to do. The stable roof had fresh shingles. The house porch sagged at one corner. A framed photograph of a fair-haired woman stood on a shelf inside. "My wife, Rebecca," Jonah said when he saw Nan look. "5 years gone." Nan nodded. She did not offer the easy comfort strangers usually gave. Behind the house lay a dead garden enclosed by a low stone border. Cracked soil, dry vines, half-buried planting markers. Beside it, an old wooden trough leaked water into a patch of weeds. At supper, Jonah opened Evelyn's letter. The lamp flame moved over his face while he read. Evelyn thanked him for every word he had sent through her last winter. She admitted she had known she would never see Wyoming. She asked him not to turn her death into another reason to stop living. Near the end, she had written that Nan understood the words between them better than anyone. The final line made him pause. Jonah read it twice before folding the page. "She was certain you'd leave." Nan kept her eyes on the beans cooling in her bowl. "I came to finish her promise. Mine ends at the station." Before dawn, she packed her suitcase. Jonah was saddling the wagon when he found her behind the house, kneeling in the abandoned garden with a rusted hand trowel. She had uncovered a rosemary root beneath the dead growth. Moisture darkened the earth under the crust. Nearby, old trenches remained faintly visible, leading from the leaking trough. "Nothing has grown there in years," Jonah said. Nan broke apart a hard clod. The center was dark and cool. "Nothing has been asked to grow properly." She stood and brushed dirt from her palms. "I'll restore the beds and look over those unopened invoices beside your ledger. You give me tools, meals, the east room, and whatever seed remains. When the train comes, I leave whether anything grows or not. The wind strips seedlings clean. The well can't spare much." Nan carried her suitcase back to the porch and set it beneath the roof. "Then the land has 12 days to prove us both wrong." That evening, Jonah brought out his mother's old seed box. Most packets were empty. One held a few dried tomato and bean seeds. Nan made a planting marker, wrote the date, and pressed the first seed into the soil. Jonah watched her cover it with both hands. Then his eyes settled on the slant of her handwriting. It was the same hand that had filled Evelyn's letters. He said nothing. "Do you want me to continue?" By the 4th morning, Nan's hands were blistered. She had loosened the garden soil with Jonah's old fork, worked in rotted manure from behind the stable, and shaped shallow basins around each row so the water would sink instead of running off. At night, she covered the beds with feed sacks weighted by stones. Then the western wind came. It struck after midnight, hard enough to shake the porch boards and rattle the chimney cap. By dawn, 2 coverings were gone. One lay against the pasture fence. Another had torn down the middle. The topsoil had hardened. Several seeds were missing, and one of Jonah's wooden stakes had snapped. Jonah stood beside the garden with a coffee cup in his hand. Nayen expected him to say he had warned her. He did not. She walked the yard slowly, watching how dust gathered along the north wall and where the grass bent beneath the wind. Then she turned toward the barn. "I need the scrapboards behind your workbench." "For what?" "A windbreak." He studied her face. "You still think something's coming up?" "I think we made the same mistake twice." "We?" Nayan looked at him. Jonah set down his cup. They spent the morning rebuilding. He cut old fence boards with a cross-cut saw while Nan measured the height with a length of twine. They repaired the low stone wall, dug a narrow channel from the leaking trough, and set a rain barrel where wasted water had been soaking the weeds. When a splinter opened Jonah's palm, Nan took a clean strip from the hem of an old cloth and wrapped it around his hand. "You carry bandages in your pocket?" he asked. "I carry cloth. Men find ways to need it." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. As they braced the shade frame, their shoulders touched. Neither stepped away at once. By noon, the garden looked less like a grave and more like work in progress. That evening, Jonah found Nan at the kitchen table with his ledger open. and 3 store receipts laid beside it. "You paid Harlan's feed twice for the same delivery," she said. Jonah pulled out the chair across from her. "That doesn't sound like me. It sounds exactly like a man who keeps figures in his head." She pointed to the dates. Same weight, same wagon charge, same driver's mark. He leaned closer. Her handwriting ran in neat columns, the same slanted letters he had studied in Evelyn's pages. Non continued before he could ask. "2 horses were repaired here last winter, no payment recorded. 4 cattle losses have no dates, and you're buying grain from 40 miles south when Chen's cousin hauls it from Laramie for less. You know accounts. My father bought produce for St. Louis merchants. He taught us numbers because he had no sons." "Us?" "Evelyn and me." Non closed one receipt. She told him about summers along the Missouri River, helping relatives raise onions, beans, and herbs for market. During Evelyn's illness, she had grown food behind their rented house because purchased vegetables cost more each month. Jonah listened without interruption. Later, he brought Evelyn's letterbox to the table. He opened one at random and read aloud. "Hard ground does not mean dead ground. Sometimes it only means no one stayed long enough to soften it." Naan's fingers stopped on the ledger page. "You said nearly the same thing yesterday," he said. The lamp flame trembled between them. "Did you write this?" "I held the pen when she grew weak." "Were the words hers?" Naan looked toward the dark window, where the new windbreak stood against the moonlit yard. "They began with her." Jonah folded the letter, but did not put it away. The next afternoon, Howard Briggs rode through the ranch gate in a clean brown coat with county maps strapped behind his saddle. He laid a purchase offer on Jonah's table. "The mine's thinning out," Briggs said. "Rail service will follow. Sell before the whole valley drops another $1 an acre." His eyes moved to Naan and the ledger. "A garden won't hold this place together." "Miss Cross manages the garden and the accounts," Jonah said. Briggs gave a polite little nod. "Until the next train, I assume." Naan met his gaze. "That depends on what grows." Briggs left the offer behind. That night, Jonah fed it into the stove 1 page at a time. On the 12th morning, Naan packed her suitcase. The seedbeds still looked empty. Jonah harnessed the wagon and brought it around without asking whether she had changed her mind. Naan lifted her suitcase from the porch. Then she stopped. A thin crack had opened in the nearest row. She set the suitcase down and knelt. From the dark soil rose one small bean shoot, bent beneath a grain of dirt, trembling in the morning wind. Jonah stood behind her, holding the reins. "One sprout isn't a harvest." "No," Naan said, "but it means the ground answered." He returned to the house and came back with the ledger. Inside was a written agreement. Wages for managing the accounts. A share of anything the garden produced. The east room, no debt for meals. Freedom to leave whenever she chose. The arrangement would end after the first harvest. Naan read every line. "Why put it in writing?" Jonah looked toward the distant smoke of the departing train. "Because staying shouldn't turn into owing." Naan signed beneath his name. "Until the first harvest." That night, Jonah opened Evelyn's letters again. He placed Nayan's signature beside them. The handwriting matched. But it was not the handwriting that troubled him most. It was the humor, the stubbornness, the faith in hard land. All the things he had waited to read each week now belonged to the woman walking softly past his door. For the first time, Jonah Hale no longer knew whom he had been waiting for. "Do you want me to continue?" Summer came slowly to Dust Valley. The tomato rows strengthened behind the house. Bean vines climbed the new trellis. Jonah repaired the leaking trough, moved cattle off the exhausted west pasture, and added a narrow shelf near the kitchen window for Nine's journals and seed packets. They began taking supper at the same hour. Neither spoke of it as a habit. Nayan left one lamp burning when Jonah rode the fence line after dark. Jonah brought cold water to the garden before she asked. Once he bought a bottle of better ink in town and claimed Mrs. Chen's clerk had placed it in his parcel by mistake. Nan did not challenge the lie. She simply used the ink. One afternoon, a red hen chased Jonah across the yard after he disturbed her nest. Nan laughed before she could stop herself. Jonah turned at the gate. The sound faded from her face, but he had already heard it. He watched her a moment too long. By then, Nan could recognize the rhythm of his horse before he reached the ranch. She knew when his left shoulder ached by the way he removed his coat. He knew she was troubled when she counted the same ledger column twice. Evelyn remained between them. One evening, Jonah opened a letter while Nayan sat across from him repairing the binding of an account book. "A person can miss a home before seeing it," he read. Nan's needle stopped. Did she mean Dust Valley? She wanted to. "That isn't what I asked." Nan lowered her eyes to the torn leather. She spent her last winter beside one window. Some days wanting was all she had. Jonah folded the letter carefully. He did not ask who had written that line. Outside Mrs. Chen's boarding house the next week, Howard Briggs stepped into Nan's path. His coat was brushed clean despite the wind. "Hale's still refusing my offer." "That sounds like business between you and him." "He was waiting for your sister." Nan held the wrapped seed jars against her chest. Briggs smiled without warmth. A lonely man can confuse a familiar voice with love. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway behind him. "Dust Valley has survived men who mistook desperation for opportunity," she said. Briggs tipped his hat and walked away. That evening, Jonah and Nan sat on the porch with frost calculations spread between them. The sun had gone red behind the cliffs. Jonah watched her write. "When I think about winter now," he said, "I see you at this table." Nan's pencil stopped. "You don't know whether you see me or the woman from those letters." "I know you're not Evelyn." "Do you know where one voice ended and the other began?" Jonah had no answer. Nan closed the ledger and went inside. The next morning, hoofbeats struck the ranch road hard enough to scatter the chickens. A teenage rider pulled up at the gate, dust white on his face. "Mr. Hale, the north shaft collapsed. 6 men are down." Jonah dropped the wheel wrench in his hand. "Who?" "Elias Mercer, Clara Bell's brother, 4 others." Jonah was moving before the boy finished. For the boy, he gathered rope, lanterns, a timber axe, wet cloth, water, gloves, and the short-handled shovel he had used during his mine seasons. Nan caught him beside the wagon. "How bad?" "Bad enough they sent for every man who knows the lower passage." "I'm coming." "They need names kept straight, water marked, families held back from the shaft. You can do more above than I can." It was not dismissal. It was trust. Mrs. Chen arrived with her wagon. Within minutes, Jonah's kitchen became a supply room. Bread was wrapped, bandages boiled, blankets counted. Nan wrote the names of the trapped men in the back of her ledger. At the mine, the hillside crawled with lanterns and frightened people. Men hauled stone from the entrance. Women carried buckets. Children ran messages between wagons. Dust hung thick beneath the afternoon sun. Briggs stood near the ridge in polished boots. He never went closer to the tunnel. Jonah entered with the first rescue party. When he emerged, an injured miner lay across his shoulders. Blood marked Jonah's sleeve, but his footing remained steady. Nan moved toward him. He passed the man to waiting hands and reached for fresh rope. "Let someone else go." "Elias is still in there." "And if the roof takes you?" Jonah looked at her. "Then I'll know I didn't leave him." He disappeared into the dark. A deep crack rolled through the mountain. Dust burst from the tunnel mouth. Every voice stopped. Nan stood with Jonah's spare gloves twisted between her hands. Clara Bell began praying beside her children. Mrs. Chen pressed one palm against Nan's back. Minutes passed. Then Jonah stumbled out supporting another miner. His face was gray with dust, and he could barely draw breath. "2 left," he said. Before the final descent, Nan caught his sleeve. Do what you have to do. Jonah searched her face. Will you be here when I come out? Yes. No train, no harvest, no condition. Just yes. Night settled over the ridge. Lanterns trembled around the tunnel entrance. At last, a shout rose from below. Jonah and Elias appeared carrying the final miner between them. The crowd broke into cries. Jonah reached open ground, swayed, and dropped to one knee. Nan ran to him. She gripped his coat and pressed her face against his chest. I thought the earth had taken you. His torn hand settled against her back. You told me to come back. She lifted her face. For one breath, they nearly kissed. Nan stopped. On the moonlit ride home, Jonah held the reins loosely in his bandaged hands. I'm falling in love with you, he said. Nayen closed her fingers around Evelyn's blue ribbon inside her pocket. Shh, you can't say that yet. Jonah slowed the horses. Why? She looked toward the dark shape of Hale Ranch. Because you still don't know which woman was speaking to you in those letters. Do you want me to continue? Back at Hale Ranch, Jonah sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped in clean cloth. Nayen warmed water on the stove. She set the basin near him, then stepped back before he could mistake care for an answer. Outside, the garden shifted beneath the night wind. Bean leaves brushed the trellis. Somewhere near the stable, a horse struck one hoof against the boards. Jonah placed Evelyn's letterbox on the table. Nan looked at it for a long while. I'll tell you at sunrise. She spent the night packing. Her work dress was folded at the bottom of the canvas suitcase. The East Room key went beside Jonah's coffee cup. She copied the last feed totals into the ledger, then wrote instructions for watering the garden if the wind turned hot again. In the barn, Jonah sat beneath a hanging lantern with Evelyn's letters beside him. He did not open them. At dawn, Nan found him on the porch. The sky was pale over the red cliffs. Jonah's bandaged hands rested on his knees. Nan remained standing. At first, Evelyn dictated every word. I only held the pen. Jonah said nothing. When she grew weaker, she lost whole thoughts halfway through. She would tell me to finish them. Make them sound hopeful, she said. Nan's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. I wrote about land, work, loneliness, things she felt, and things I felt beside her. Near the end, some pages were more mine than hers. Jonah looked toward the garden. Did she know? She read them. She approved them. And you? Nan's voice lowered. I began waiting for your replies. The silence between them sharpened. I never signed my name, she said, but I started hoping you were answering me. Jonah rose slowly. Which words were hers? Nan swallowed. Near the end, I don't know. His face did not change. That made it worse. Did you come here hoping to take her place? No. The garden. I stayed because it needed work. And because... Nan looked at him directly. Because I wanted to. Jonah turned away. I mourned a woman I may never have known. You knew her, Nan said. You just heard part of me beside her. He walked to the barn without answering. Hours passed. Jonah repaired a harness that did not need repair. Nan carried her suitcase to Mrs. Chen's wagon. She did not ask him to stop her. Mrs. Chen saw the key in Nan's hand and understood. The train leaves near sundown. Nan nodded. After the wagon disappeared, Jonah returned to the garden. The first tomato flower had opened beside the wall. He stood over it, then went inside. At the station, Howard Briggs waited with his county maps tied beneath one arm. Hale was expecting your sister, he said. Dust Valley will always remember that. Nan set her suitcase beside the bench. I'm leaving because I withheld the truth, not because you decided I don't belong. Briggs smiled faintly. When the mine closes, he'll sell. Jonah would burn the deed before selling to a man who waits for hungry people to surrender. Back at the ranch, Jonah finally opened Evelyn's last letter. Several paragraphs began with letters written slightly larger than the rest. He read the first words together. Let her speak as herself. Below the main text, Evelyn's weakened hand had added one final note. Nyan gave me words when illness took mine. Do not call her a thief for carrying hope I could no longer carry alone. Whatever future remains belongs to the living. Jonah read it twice. Then he remembered. Non trying to leave. Non demanding written wages. Non stopping their kiss. Non telling the truth when silence would have protected her. He took Evelyn's letter, the ledger, Non's signed agreement, and the first ripe tomato from the garden. Then he saddled his horse. The train whistle sounded as he reached the station road. Nan stood beside Mrs. Chen with one hand on her suitcase. Jonah dismounted before the horse stopped moving. He did not begin with love. I was wrong. Nayan looked at him. I let silence punish you. I saw the letters before I saw the woman standing in front of me, and I forgot what it cost you to tell me. He handed her Evelyn's final note. Nayan read it, then folded it carefully. Her forgiveness cannot become yours. It won't. Jonah opened the ledger. He had written a new agreement. Nan would control the garden and agricultural accounts. She would receive half the produce profits. Her wages would continue regardless of what happened between them. The planting records belonged to her. She could leave without debt. He could not sell the garden acreage during the partnership without her consent. Nan looked up. You brought business papers to stop a woman from leaving. I won't ask you to stay where your future depends on my feelings. The conductor called for passengers. Jonah's voice lowered. I'm not asking for Evelyn's sister. I'm asking for the woman who argued with dead ground and made it answer. Nan looked at the open train door, then at his bandaged hands. Do you trust me? Not because there was no lie, because you gave me the truth when it could cost you everything. The conductor called again. Nan lifted her suitcase. For one breath, Jonah's face went still. Then she set it back on the platform. The train pulled away without her. Jonah reached for her hand. Nan did not take it at once. I'm staying as your partner. Jonah nodded. That's enough. Only then did she place her hand in his. Behind them, Howard Briggs watched the train disappear into the red haze and understood that Hale Ranch would no longer be easy to take. Do you want me to continue? The mine closed 3 days later. County inspectors nailed a notice across the north shaft gate and ordered new supports before another man went below. By the end of the week, store credit tightened. Families began counting flour by the cup. Howard Briggs rode from house to house with cash offers folded inside his coat. Dust Valley expected Jonah to speak for them. Instead, he set the ranch ledger before Nan. They need more than a speech. Nan sharpened her pencil. The plan began at Hale Ranch's kitchen table. Small gardens that used little water, shared tools, stable manure worked into exhausted soil, repair of the old irrigation ditch, chickens and goats for families who could no longer afford cattle, seed recorded, divided, and replaced after harvest. Mrs. Chen offered her boarding house kitchen for preserving food. Elias Mercer, still walking with a cane, gathered unemployed miners to clear the ditch. Clara Bell offered the dry patch behind her house. At the town meeting, Howard Briggs stood near the stove and called the plan foolish. Vegetables won't replace mine wages. No, Nan said, but they may keep children fed while the mine is silent. She placed Hale Ranch's figures on the table. Water amounts, seed costs, a jar of preserved beans, a basket holding the first tomatoes. Some men stared at the floor rather than take instruction from a newcomer. Jonah did not argue with them. He stepped beside Nan, then moved aside and gave her the front of the room. Clara Bell stood first. "I'll try." Elias raised one hand. "I'll bring 6 men to the ditch tomorrow." Others followed. Briggs left before the vote was finished. Through late summer, Dust Valley changed by inches. Former miners swung shovels along the old ditch. Jonah repaired pumps and gates. Non measured seed into paper packets and wrote each family's name across the fold. Mrs. Chen taught women to seal jars and stretch stew with squash and beans. Green patches began appearing between gray houses. Jonah left a lamp burning when Nayen worked late in town. Nayen kept his supper warm until she heard his horse at the gate. When they disagreed over how much seed to save, they settled it over the ledger instead of letting pride finish the argument. Beside the repaired well one evening, Jonah touched her cheek. This time, Non did not stop him. Their kiss was quiet. No crowd, no borrowed name between them. Briggs made one final attempt. He filed a claim at the county office saying the repaired ditch crossed land he had purchased. He threatened to block water unless families sold him part of their harvest. Jonah reached for his coat. Non closed the ledger. "Not with your fists." She searched old records with the station clerk. Mrs. Chen found freight receipts showing the town had purchased ditch timber years earlier. Elias remembered maintaining the channel before Briggs owned a single acre nearby. At the county hearing, Non laid every document before the judge. Briggs owned the adjoining land. He did not own the water right. His claim was denied. By early autumn, tomatoes filled baskets. Beans dried along porch lines. Squash rested beneath beds. Clara Bell's children carried supper home from ground that had produced nothing in years. Non closed the ranch ledger. "The first harvest," she said. "Our agreement is finished." Jonah asked her to walk with him. Near the well, he placed a plain iron ring in her palm. The blacksmith had shaped it from the broken pump mechanism they replaced during her first weeks. "You promised one harvest." Non turned the ring between her fingers. "And now?" "I'm asking for every season after this one." She looked at him. "As the woman you expected?" "No." Jonah's voice did not waver. "As the woman who arrived." "And Evelyn?" "She brought you here. She does not get to choose what we become." Non closed her hand around the ring. "Yes." They married before winter in Dust Valley's wooden church. Mrs. Chen altered a cream dress for Nayen. Clara's children gathered sage and late wildflowers. Elias stood beside Jonah. The church bell rang again after months of silence. Jonah promised not to hide behind grief or silence. Non promised to speak in her own voice and never disappear inside another person's needs. The following spring, the valley was still hard country. The mine had reopened only part way. Money remained scarce. Wind still stripped careless fields, but gardens dotted the red earth. At Hale Ranch, Jonah gave Non a leather-bound journal, Non Heil's notes on Dust Valley soil and gardens. She tied Evelyn's faded blue ribbon between the first pages and wrote one line. "I came carrying another woman's final words. I stayed when I learned my own voice was enough." Jonah sat beside her on the porch. "Ever think about the train you missed?" Non watched Clara Bell's children carry seedlings past the gate. "I didn't miss it," she said. "I chose not to leave." Jonah took her hand. Beyond them, the repaired well creaked. Green rose lifted beneath the spring sun, and the red cliffs held the last light of day. The land had not been saved by a miracle. It changed because two people stopped waiting for the life they expected and began building one from the truth they had. I often think about that lonely platform in Dust Valley, where one train carried away certainty and another kind of journey quietly began. Non arrived believing she was only keeping a promise for someone she loved. Jonah believed he was waiting for a future already written. Neither of them found what they expected. Instead, they found something far more difficult and far more lasting. If you've ever carried someone else's memory, wondered whether you deserved a second chance, or questioned if home could still exist after heartbreak, Perhaps a part of this story belongs to you too. Healing rarely arrives with fanfare. More often, it grows the way that first bean sprout did, small enough to overlook, strong enough to change a life if someone is willing to keep watering it. Maybe love isn't about finding the perfect person at the perfect time. Maybe it's about having the courage to be fully seen, to tell the truth even when it could cost everything, and to stay when walking away would be easier. If Nan and Jonah's journey stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments which moment touched your heart the most, or what part of their story reminded you of your own life. And if stories of quiet courage, enduring love, forgotten places, and souls finding their way home speak to you, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more heartfelt journeys waiting just beyond the next trail.